Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the July Future Influencers webinar. I am John Wilson, Head of Technical at Spence and Partners. I'll be chairing today's webinar, but the people doing the real work today are Emer Maguire from Dalriada Trustees, who will be speaking to us about the Pensions Regulator's latest annual funding statement, and also Richard Walker from Argyll Covenant, who will be talking to the subject of covenant and climate change risk. Now, a little bit of housekeeping just before we get started. The platform that we're using today is Teams, and it's the normal Teams platform as opposed to Teams Live, which some of you may have also used. So it means that everyone can be seen and heard, and indeed we're hoping for lots of engagement and discussion, and there will be an opportunity specifically for that when we go into some breakout sessions. But you can also ask questions after the end of each presentation as well. And you don't need to use the chat facility, but you can do so if you wish, and I will moderate that. The session is expected to last about an hour today, including the questions and the breakout sessions. And I think, Emer, I am handing over to you to start.
Thanks, John. So hi everyone, as John kindly introduced, my name is Emer Maguire. I joined the group almost 7 years ago, just for those who don't know me. Qualified as an actuary in 2018, and for the last 10 months or so have been working with Dalriada in the ongoing trusteeship area. So I'm sure this topic will be familiar to many of those on the call. So I'm going to take us through the key themes arising from the Pension Regulator's annual funding statement, which was issued recently. So this will include a quick recap on what the statement represents, analysis of the key risks for trustees and employers to consider, and what trustees can expect from TPR, and equally what TPR expects from trustees. So Kaz, if you can move to the next slide, please. So firstly, a bit of background. So what is the annual funding statement 21? So TPR releases an annual funding statement each year, providing guidance for trustees on the approach they should take with regards to their actuarial valuations. It's relevant not only for trustees, but also for sponsoring employers and just for the pensions industry in general, and is relevant to all occupational DB pension schemes. So this year's statement is primarily aimed at Tranche 16 valuations. So Tranche 16 valuations are those that have dates falling between the 22nd of September 2020 and the 21st of September 21. The statement this year provides us with an update regarding the status of the long-awaited new DB funding code, basically noting that it is delayed and will not come into force until late 22 at the earliest. So in the meantime, TPR has said it will regulate all valuations according to the requirements of existing legislation and guidance that is currently in force. So broadly looking at these Tranche 16 schemes, their funding level has broadly improved over the last 3 years to 31 March 21, but there has been some variation observed at an individual level when compared to the aggregate analysis. And it has been observed that schemes that hedged interest and inflation rate risk have fared better over the intervaluation period than those who haven't. So key themes arising from this year's statement relates to COVID-19, Brexit, climate change, and the key pillars of integrated risk management, which we'll cover a little bit later. So next slide, please, Kaz. So primarily looking at a key message from the statement on COVID-19 for trustees and employers to consider. So COVID continues to have a significant impact on the economy, challenging employers and the pensions industry in general. Trustees are first line of defence for pension savers and their schemes, so it's essential they remain alert and prepare and plan accordingly and are ready to act as needed. So I think the three categories, well illustrated just in the diagram on the slide, shows the three different subsets. So at one end of the spectrum, we have sponsoring employers who observed a limited impact from COVID. So really, these are for, sponsors where there's likely been no balance sheet weakening and cash flow position has remained strong. On the other end of the spectrum, we have sponsors which observed a material impact from COVID-19. So these are companies where the pace of recovery is uncertain and could take many years, or the business may indeed never fully recover. So short-term affordability is stressed here, and the balance sheet has weakened due to measures taken to raise additional liquidity and to secure covenant waivers. So medium-term prospects in that sense are unclear. And in the middle, we have firms where they had an initial impact from the implications from COVID, but they have either since recovered or are in the process of recovering. So since the pandemic began, several measures were introduced to help support businesses. And as they come to an end, the regulators anticipating many sponsors could experience additional short-term liquidity pressures. So any weakening of the balance sheet here can be repaired over a short period, and the medium-term prospects are not considered to have been materially impacted. Next slide, please, Kaz. So as we would expect and consistent with prior years, the pillars of integrated risk management remain a central theme in the funding statement. So if we take these three pillars in turn, funding. So this year's statement specifically highlights the importance for trustees of stress testing and conducting scenario analysis to help them understand the material risks faced by their schemes and gauge and get a feel for the impact on their technical provisions through the use of these sensitivities. And regarding investment, so in recent years, the statement has encouraged trustees to develop a long-term funding target and just really getting trustees to think about end game planning and clearly investment considerations are important here in terms of putting in place appropriate de-risking strategies as schemes move closer to these endpoints. I attended a Association of Consultant Actuaries conference recently, and they were really drawn out, the TPR team on that were really drawn out how liquidity considerations will continue to become increasingly important, and these form a key part of the consultation for the new DB funding code. Coming to covenant, so we've just touched on the previous slide around the impact of COVID-19 and the different subgroups referring to the effects for different sponsors of COVID. So TPR's rapid response team have been monitoring those schemes where they consider the risk of a poor sponsor covenant to be higher. As well as a suitable framework and governance structure, it's important to have potential mitigation strategies in place should any of these IRM warning lights begin to flash red as such. So as well as sitting alongside IRM, we have climate change, which I know Richard will cover in a bit more detail later on. But the statement really emphasises the requirement for trustees to consider the impact of climate change on their IRM framework. So TPR has summarised that they expect a proactive approach to be taken by trustees to assess, mitigate and monitor climate change risk, and that is key to successful safer outcomes. So climate change considerations may impact on the assumptions used in actuarial valuations, the investment strategy and the sponsor covenant. So trustees and employers should be aware that guidance given to actuaries alerts them to the need to factor the effects of climate change into their advice as well. So trustees, I think it's just the statement really emphasises they should be aware of TPR's climate change strategy, which outlines their expectations that all schemes will comply with existing requirements to publish, for example, their SIP and their implementation statement. And these disclosures represent compliance with the basics of climate change, and TPR will be using those to monitor how trustees are using scenario analysis and engagement activities to manage risk associated with climate change. And at that ACA webinar, the they also mentioned that the idea of this IRM framework that's currently, the pyramid shape with funding, investment and covenant, basically exploring the idea it could become more of an IRM square to incorporate climate change and, consideration of how that interlinks with the other pillars. Next slide, please, Kaz. So a few other considerations evident from the funding statement are those around Brexit and scheme maturity. So taking Brexit first, for some businesses, the uncertainty over the covenant may have been heightened further by the UK's departure from the EU and consequential changes in trading conditions. So in these cases, TPR does expect trustees to review the covenant to understand whether any impacts are short-term or whether they represent a more fundamental change. They could also consider the impact of any change to the employer's competitive position, to their ability to access the EU market and access labour force, for example. So where the impacts are considered more material, the employer's ability to invest to adapt to the new trading relationships could be important as well. So trustees need to examine how the investment's funded, whether it impacts the affordability of DRCs and how the scheme will benefit from the investment. And it's really highlighting that trustees should, seek to take independent specialist covenant advice where they deem appropriate. So looking at scheme maturity, a key theme in the statement in recent years is this concept of long-term funding target. And since the majority of schemes are now closed to new members, TPR expects scheme maturity issues to assume greater importance for setting funding and investment strategies. So in the context of scheme funding, the important considerations are around the interaction and the relationship between the level of assets, the degree of underfunding, the amount of benefits paid out, as well as the scheme's ability to close the funding gap through investment and new contributions in a reasonable time frame. So TPR highlights that it expects advisors to alert trustees to the risks to funding and investment from increasing scheme maturity, and trustees should ensure that the employer is funding to a level where the risks are considered to be appropriately managed. So just how this links into the long-term funding target, although not a requirement, defining a long-term funding target is expected to become a requirement in the Pension Schemes Act 21, and TPR encourages trustees and employers to specify and agree these in advance. So be that self-sufficiency, be that buyout, it's just TPR is really encouraging trustees to define this long-term funding target and to discuss it. And I think that's been a prevalent theme in the statement in recent years. Next slide, please, Kaz. So the table on this slide basically summarises a group, basically a group diagram that TPR have included in the statement. So it helpfully sets out in tabular form the group which each pension scheme belongs to, depending on their employer strength, funding level and maturity. So this is to help TPR or to help trustees to determine which group their particular scheme sits in. For example, if we have a scheme where it has a weak employer with limited affordability and a weak funding level and a longer recovery plan, so a longer recovery plan by TPR's definition would be greater than, say, 7 years, we'd expect that scheme to be in box D. So in this year's statement, this would then be subdivided further into whether the scheme's mature or immature. So D1, for instance, if it's mature, if it's immature, and D2 if it's mature. So just a really helpful guide for trustees to look at in the statement to kind of see where they sit based on the characteristics of their scheme. Next slide, please, Kaz. Yeah, so this brings us on to, I suppose, what TPR expects from trustees. So we've touched on some of these already. For instance, scenario analysis, stress testing, and the key pillars of IRM. But looking at a few others, so inflation. So where pension increases are currently linked to inflation, trustees should choose their assumptions carefully between pre and post 2030 when RPI becomes aligned to CPIH. So looking at mortality, so the immediate impact of COVID on mortality has for most schemes been low, but the long-term impacts will take some time to emerge. And TPR's view is that trustees should ensure their mortality assumptions are balanced. So while we don't anticipate a material impact on longevity, evidence will continue to come to light over time. And the key is the impact on the members of your scheme, who will likely be different from the UK population at large. So mentioned in recovery plans, so trustees can consider taking account of post-valuation experience, but it's really highlighted in the statement, trustees need to be consistent with that kind of approach. They shouldn't cherry pick. So for instance, if they took advantage of positive post-valuation experience at the last valuation, they should, in theory, take account of it again at this valuation, even if the effect is negative of that. It's just a consistent approach. And looking at DRCs, so consistent with prior years, the statement really highlights the need for trustees to do their best to ensure that the scheme is getting a fair deal. So that's just that it's being treated equitably and among other creditors of the employer, and just in terms of the relationship between DRCs and dividends. So it's just making sure that the scheme is being treated equitably, really. And as well, it's just like where employers continue to request liquidity and liquidity support from the pension scheme through DRC deferrals, for instance. The regulator expects trustees to obtain suitable mitigations. And also they expect a continued focus on equitable treatment, other forms of potential covenant leakage, such as the likes of bonus payments, for instance. Next slide, please, Kaz. So I suppose looking at the reverse, what can trustees expect from TPR in return? So where sponsoring employers are in distress, TPR will engage these schemes if they have concerns to ensure they're following the guidance. So looking at supervision, TPR will assess valuation submissions they receive in a proportionate way. So these risk assessments look at the overall risk profile of a scheme relative to the ability of an employer to support it. So it's therefore important that trustees and employers are fully aware of TPR's expectations, and that trustees and employers should be fully prepared to justify their actions and explain their approach and provide supporting evidence. So lastly, we have TPR's suite of powers. So TPR do have the power to direct how a scheme's technical provisions should be derived and to set an appropriate recovery plan length. They can use this power where there's been a failure to agree or where they consider the proposed recovery plan not to be sufficient. But TPR can achieve appropriate outcomes without having to use that power, but they may investigate if they believe that trustees or employers have not acted in line with the guidance. And the Pension Schemes Act 21 has introduced a package of measures and aims to help drive better standards across the schemes that TPR regulates. Next slide, please, Kaz. So just in summary, the statement is clear that the overarching focus should remain on long-term planning and risk management, and it ends with the above statement, which I think quite neatly captures the key themes arising from the statement. So I suppose that brings us to the end of the presentation on the annual funding statement, but happy to take any questions. I think we're going to do those at the end of both presentations. But thanks for listening, and I'll pass you over to Richard.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Emma. Really appreciate that. Yeah, good morning, everyone. My name's Richard Walker. I'm a Covenant Advisor at Argyle Covenant, and I've been working in Covenant now for about 5 years, advising trustees and corporates. And before that, I worked in restructuring and insolvency for a number of years. Now, today I'm going to talk to you about employee covenant and climate change. So, Kaz, if you could switch to the next slide, please. So, yeah, in terms of agenda, I'm just going to cover off a brief overview of typical covenant considerations to set the scene, a whistle-stop tour of climate change and why it matters, why climate change matters for DB pensions, a quick case study of how a business should be approaching climate change risks, and then some final thoughts on next steps. So, Kaz, if you can switch to the next slide, please. Okay. So on this slide, I just wanted to provide a bit of a flavour really of the sorts of things we look at when we're assessing a covenant, and each of them affect demand, income or cost, and ultimately profit. And as you'll see on the rest of the presentation, many of these are also relevant to or could be impacted by climate change. And it's probably not unfair to say that to date, covenant advisors haven't really got a handle on climate change risks or what that might mean for the sponsor. But I think it's something we need to start thinking about. So we can switch to the next one, guys. Okay. So what is climate change? So climate change is simply a change in Earth's climate. This could be a change in Earth's usual temperature, or it could be a change in where rain or snow might usually fall. Weather can change in just a few hours, but climate takes hundreds or even millions of years to change. Now, Earth's temperature has gone up by about 1 degree in the last 100 years, and without significant intervention, projections show that temperature rises could be accelerating. The chart shown on the page here hopefully illustrates what the different temperature projections could look like over a range of different scenarios. And based on current pledges, so for example, the 2015 Paris Agreement, temperatures forecast to rise between 2.7 and 3 degrees Celsius. So some of you who trying to escape to sunnier climates this summer, good luck with that, by the way, might be wondering what all the fuss is about an extra 2 degrees temperature rise, but the impact could be significant. Now, reports vary, but there are some that indicate that 2 degrees of warming could lead to 10% of the world population needing to relocate. And with 3 degrees, 35% of lives could be at risk. And even if you take those stats with a pinch of salt, none of this is good news. Now, the problem with what I've just said and what I wanted to illustrate with this graph on this slide is that people see graphs like this and assume it's something that we just don't need to worry about at the moment, but that really isn't the case. You might be surprised to hear that already there are around 16,000 fatalities across G20 countries that are due to extreme weather events each year, with an estimated economic impact of about $142 billion per annum. Now, to illustrate this, you just need to look at, I think last week or the week before's news from North America, where Canada had record high temperatures, leaving dozens dead. There were melted cables in the road, there were rolling blackouts to cope with power demands. Agricultural workers had to start at dawn and finish at noon to cope with the heat. And even Amazon were letting the general public into their headquarters as a cooling off location. But this is just one example in one location. So let's not forget this is a global issue, and the outlook for each country is very different. So if we switch to the next slide, Kaz. Okay, this slide, I'm showing a graphic produced by the IPCC, which is Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. So each symbol on the map represents a different climate change impact, and the more coloured bars next to each symbol means that there's a greater confidence that climate change will contribute to that particular problem. So focusing just on the UK for a minute, climate change is expected to impact on health and economics and on our marine ecosystem, albeit the impact is perhaps lower than when compared to like other countries. So bring this kind of back to employer covenant, in a hypothetical scenario where a scheme's employer is based in the UK, all of his staff, clients, suppliers are based in the UK, you can see where I'm going here, all the suppliers source all their raw materials from the UK, etc., then you probably only need to focus on the UK in related to climate change risks. And there are some. So, for example, we are expected to see hotter and more frequent heat waves. You may recall heat waves in the early noughties that were linked to a large number of excess deaths. And we're also expecting to see an increase in rainfall and risk of flooding. And that's just the UK. In the majority of cases, an employer will have touch points with many other countries around the world, each with their own unique climate change risk factors, as highlighted by this slide. If we take the recent problem that auto manufacturers have had with the lack of supply of microchips, and I appreciate that this wasn't all related to climate change, but it does illustrate well why we need to consider these sorts of risks. And so how did that happen? Well, there were three things really. The first was coronavirus, obviously. Immediately following the outbreak, people stopped buying cars, and they saw an increased demand. Which led to a significant drop-off in orders from car manufacturers. Tech firms, however, carried on making their products and even saw an increase in demand for things like phones, laptops, games consoles, etc. Now that people are starting to buy cars again, car makers are now back at the queue, and microchip factories take up to 6 months to restart production, and this has left car makers with severe delays in their supply chain. Second thing, storms in Texas. So approximately 12% of the world's microchips are made in the US, with a large proportion of those coming from Texas. In February this year, Texas had one of the worst storms in its history, and that led to widespread power cuts, and a number of microchip factories shut down, and some of these took 4 months to get production back to normal. And finally, in March this year, there was a plant fire in Japan, and its full microchip production didn't restart until July. So my point being, had anyone foreseen any of these risks? Was any mitigation in place? And if not, why not? So Kaz, if you can switch to the next one, please. Okay, so bringing this all back to the pensions industry, and as I'm sure you're all aware, and as Emma mentioned as well in her presentation, there's been a lot of increasing pressure on schemes to understand, assess and report their climate change exposure. And this pressure is core to what pensions industry is being asked to consider in the recent DWP consultation. The focus to date has been on the investment side of things, which is absolutely the right step in the right direction. In the TPR's climate change strategy that was published in April this year, the TPR warns of the potentially significant impact climate change may have on sponsors, and therefore integration of covenant, actuarial and investment risk will be key. They also acknowledge that every business, all parts of the economy and the financial market will be impacted by climate change. We feel, though, that more could be done when it comes to covenant. And the reason we think this is because a DB pension scheme is the only one true long-term stakeholder for many businesses, with every other stakeholder, including staff, clients, lenders, investors, etc., temporary at best. The responsibility is therefore on the scheme, trustees and advisors to put moral and fiduciary pressure on sponsors to be sustainable over the longer term, with the first step being to properly understand the key climate change risks that they face. Kaz, if you can switch to the next one, please. Okay, so how do you do that? I thought I'd take you through a quick case study in a moment. But before I do that, just a bit of background. When I was obviously reading up on this topic, I found it really fascinating, actually, that there are loads of well-known companies who appear to be doing something about climate change. For example, they might have an ESG committee, or they're targeting net zero by 2050 or some other far-off date. But from what I could see, very few seem to be identifying specific risks to their business and therefore the covenant. And then I came across the following stat, and it was a survey by the Chartered Institute of Internal Auditors. And they polled over 100 CEOs at some of the largest firms in the UK on their approach to preparing for climate change. And 52% had done either little or no work to prevent climate change risks. And I found that amazing, given that these are the some of the biggest companies in the country, and it probably means that an even higher proportion of smaller firms are in a similar position. And I think this highlights the point I made earlier that many people consider climate change not a risk that needs to be dealt with now, and something that should be considered in the future. Having said that, there are some firms doing some really good work, and one example, as you can see on the slide, is I found that was Sainsbury's, and I just thought it'd be worth running through some of the things that they were looking at, and I split those risks that they've identified into physical risks and transition risks. So for those who don't know, physical risks are risks associated with higher global temperatures as a result from taking no further policy action. And those things could be like damage to property from severe weather, or supply chain disruption. And then you've got transition risks. Those are risks that arise with a move to a low carbon economy, and they could relate to costs associated with a changing policy, consumer sentiment, and speedy transition. So looking at the table, I just thought I'd go through a few of these. So first off, physical risk-wise, flooding risk. I've already mentioned that climate change is expected to affect rainfall extremes in the UK, and that could lead to an increase in frequency and intensity of flooding. Now, Sainsbury's have stores across the UK, including in a number of areas at risk of flooding. The risk with Sainsbury's is that flooding affects stores directly, i.e. water damage, but also indirectly by preventing access for customers and suppliers. The impact of flooding could be the closure of shops or offices, it could be water damage, as I've said, and it could be dangerous to staff. Mitigation-wise, they carry out flood risk assessments and assess flood risk for new sites. And where necessary, they've got procedures for staff to follow in the event of a flood, and they've even invested in flood defence systems in certain stores. Lack of available fresh water. So they've identified that with climate change, there is a higher risk of longer and more frequent periods of drought in the UK, and this could put a strain on water supplies and also lead to high prices. Another impact is if they can't get fresh water, they can't open stores. They're not legally allowed to open up if they can't provide drinking water for employees. So in mitigation, they work with external consultants and use a tool to assess water risk in their operations. And also they're also installing over 11,000 water saving taps to help reduce water consumption. So jumping on to transition risks. So the first two, you've got cost of reducing emissions across operations and rising energy prices. They're kind of interrelated. So these new initiatives and technology to reduce emissions are really good, but they come at a significant cost. But on the flip side, if they don't implement these changes, then rates could ultimately rise from businesses being less efficient, or from things like climate change levy, which is applied to non-domestic electricity bills. In mitigation, they're investing in lots of different initiatives. I won't go through all of them, but one of which caught my eye was the fitting of aerofoils across each store, which creates an air curtain, reducing refrigeration costs by up to 15% per store. And finally, just the last two transition risks are also kind of linked. So that's reputation risk and shift in shopping and buying patterns. And these are really about consumers becoming more and more aware of climate change and wanting to reduce their own carbon emissions. And this is likely to end up with an increase in demand for sustainable products. Now, Sainsbury's actually see this as a bit of an opportunity for them to try and lead in this area and provide a broader range of sustainable products, which they hope will lead to an increase in demand, which will then turn into an increase in sales. They're also conscious that as more and more people are considering companies' values before making a purchase, that if they don't do enough, that could lead to a fall in demand for their products. And a fairly recent example of just this was when people found out that Burberry was burning excess goods, which led to some consumer boycotts. I think just to close on this slide, I think Sainsbury's is not the only firm doing some really good work. Just a quick Google, and you'll find lots of other good examples and initiatives. I'll list just a few on the left-hand side. You've got Nike, who are recycling shoes to make tracks for children's schools in America. But my personal favourite has to be Dr. Martens vegan boots. What I did forget to mention actually was on Sainsbury's, what they've also done is quite helpful is to give an estimate of the likely costs of mitigating climate risks that they've identified. And these costs are not insignificant. I think Allianz, the insurer, estimates that responding to climate change risks could cost companies worldwide as much as 2.5 trillion over the next 10 years. However, whilst the price to mitigate the risk is high, more so for certain sectors, the cost of not doing anything could be much higher. So Kaz, if you can switch to the last slide, please. Okay, so next steps. And the next steps probably depends on the answers to some of the questions on the slide. If a sponsor like Sainsbury's has a good handle on climate change risks, then the only action is probably monitoring how those risks change over time and how the employer is flexing its response to mitigating those evolving risks. At the other extreme, if an employer has not made any attempt to consider climate change risks, then there probably is a bit more, or maybe a lot more to do. But it certainly doesn't need to be anything too complicated. I think at this early stage, there just needs to be a fairly basic framework to help understand what climate change risks the employer is facing and how those risks might prevent the business from achieving its objectives. Even if the conclusion is that the risks are limited, then I think that needs to be established, first of all, and then documented. This is not something that's going away. But I'm not saying that businesses need to do anything about this in the next week or even the next few months or the next year. But I think businesses do need to have a plan for when they're going to look at it. And it should be something that needs to be in part of covenant assessments. At the very least, climate change should be part of overall thinking, at least, and ideally, there should be some proportionate observations made on climate change risks. Just to close, I think we predict in the medium to long term, it will be almost impossible to protect corporate reputation or financial success without managing climate change related risks. Businesses will need to release their policies and practices on climate change to help reduce reputation risk, and they may even benefit from having good climate change related credentials. The importance of properly assessing and managing exposure to climate change can't be overstated. And like any risks, climate change risks need to be identified and dealt with. Sponsors need to consider not what the cost is of identifying and dealing with climate change risks, but rather what is the cost of doing nothing. Thank you.
Thank you, Richard. I find this both fascinating and in some ways a little bit distressing as well. And you know, it'd be interesting to see other people's views on this. And Kaz, could I defer to you now in terms of what the process is now to further this discussion?
Yes, we can now ask questions. So there's also a chat box, or you can put your hand up as well if you want to ask a question. And then once we're finished with the questions, I'll then put everyone into the breakout rooms.
Lovely. Okay, so we'll do a Q&A first. So over to everyone else, but bearing in mind that you might be on mute at the moment. If you have any questions for Emer or for Richard, but please fire away, or if you want to use the chat facility, I will pick them up. And just while you know, people might be contemplating what the questions are going to be. I mean, Richard, one for you. I mean, this sort of a slightly different view of climate risk. You know, I've just finished going through the DWP regulations around climate risk. There's stuff that's just come out from the pensions regulator. There's the PLSA now coming up with a quality mark around climate risk and responsible investment. But you're absolutely right in what you've said, and that the focus just now seems to be on trustees and their investments. I mean, to what extent are you beginning to see schemes seeing this bigger picture and thinking about the risks and opportunity of climate change from the perspective of the sponsor covenant?
Yeah, I mean, it's something that, you know, as a firm, we're obviously interested in. I mean, and it's still, to be fair, it's still very early days. But I think what is clear, as you said, the information that is available is very focused on investment, and I think that kind of makes it really clear that something needs to be done on a covenant. But as I say, it's quite early days yet. But we are starting to start those discussions with clients, and I think they're quite receptive to that. And happy to hear our view and then start the ball rolling, if that helps. But as I say, it does seem like very early days, but so I think it's something that it would be great if the regulators could get on board with as well.
Anybody got any thoughts on that? Very interested to hear about anyone's experience, whether this is on the radar already for any of your pension schemes. Has this come up at a trustee meeting?
I think for schemes I've seen, John, it's very much trying to making sure that climate change is at least on the risk register and will be an item on agendas in meetings, just to, as you say, to get the ball rolling.
Yeah, and Emer, when you see that going onto a risk register, I mean, largely have you seen it going on, from the investment perspective, or are trustees conscious of the fact that there is the risk and opportunity considerations from their sponsor perspective too?
I think from the ones I've seen, it has been more heavily focused on the investment side. So I do agree with Richard about, it being something to incorporate, in terms of the sponsor covenant considerations as well.
Yeah. I mean, just on that kind of sponsor issue, I mean, digressing a little bit, but I mean, it all comes back to the funding of the scheme and the ability of the scheme to pay its benefits. I mean, but what about sort of Dalriada's experience of the kind of past year and a half on the impact of the global pandemic on the funding of the schemes, regulator guidance on considerations for deferring contributions? I'm not conscious of the the floodgates having been opened in terms of deferral of contributions, but I don't know if Dalriada's experience has been any different. And I'm also sort of acutely aware that this is something where you need to look both ways. It's not just about what's happened over the past year and a half, but just what your thoughts might be going forward, as we come out of lockdown and restrictions, and all the taxpayer support schemes like furlough are turned off. Presumably the expectation is we're not out of the woods yet.
Yeah, like I definitely agree with that, John. And in terms of the covenant considerations, and yeah, just that this whole IRM framework and how it should incorporate the impact of climate change as well.
Yeah, I mean, Richard, any thoughts on that kind of wider aspect of employer covenant? We all know that the impact of the past year and a half has been really sector specific, and has not just been negative, it's been really positive for some businesses as well, such as in the technology sector. Any sort of thoughts going forward, as we move to the end of arrangements like the furlough scheme?
Yeah, I mean, it's going to be interesting, isn't it? It's going to be interesting. So that's going to, yeah, wait and see. I think there's going to be a lot of. I mean, I think you look at insolvencies and they're down 30% on prior year and or pre-pandemic, and it's startling really how many businesses are perhaps holding on with their fingernails, and then potentially could fall over once that government support tax has been switched off. And as you say, there are businesses that have done actually quite well out of the situation. I was looking at an insurance company the other day, and they've done particularly well, not having to pay out any claims on motor insurance, for example. But then, yeah, so it's going to be interesting. It's going to be interesting. I think we're going to be busy over the next 12 months.
Yeah, certainly agree with that. Anyone else? Any questions for Richard or for Emer before we move into the breakout sessions?
I suppose, John, not so much a question, more just a thought. So, like prior to this call, like the only real sort of chat I'd heard about sort of climate change in the industry was in the investment sphere. So Richard's talk here is the first I've really heard about focusing on covenant, and it makes a lot of sense. But bringing it back to the IRM thing, I haven't heard much discussion on this from an actuarial perspective, and whether you would allow for it in evaluation or in funding. So potentially looking at the impact in climate change on life expectancies or actual returns on assets whenever you're working out your discount rate, whenever you consider the transition risks on the assets and stuff like that. So yeah, I suppose just wonder, has anyone else heard anything like that or thought about it, or any ideas how that would be practically allowed for? I'd imagine it'd be a good idea if you had a client that was particularly exposed to climate risk and you were working as a trustee and wanted to make that clear and probably wanted to accelerate funding for the scheme.
Yeah, I mean, again, be really interested in views in that, and I presume again, that the issue is one that can be really dependent on industry and sector. As an obvious example, organisations involved in still in fossil fuels.
Sorry, Matthew, was it a specific question? Forgive me, I might have missed the actual question, sorry.
I suppose it was more like an open question to everyone, just kind of, have they any experience in allowing for climate change on like the funding side of IRM? Because we've talked about investment and covenants, so just kind of, yeah, just looking to know if there's been any experience from the funding part of it as well.
Yeah, I mean, like any risk, I mean, if there's a risk, then what happens to that risk? Either you ignore it, or you fund it, and if you need to identify those risks in the first place, and if we're not identifying those risks in terms of climate change, then there's no way of funding those risks. Is that what you mean? Sorry, I might have misunderstood the question.
Yeah, no, that's pretty much it. Yeah, kind of. Any evaluations I've been involved in so far, there hasn't really been any sort of touch on climate risk or other ESG risks as well. So it's just kind of wondering, you know, is this just my experience, or, you know, is it other people's experience as well? Because yeah, I completely agree. There's like there are risks here, and the risks will have impact on costs. So, I mean, you either have to fund for them up front, or accept that you might suffer a loss if the risk materialize in the long term. But I suppose maybe like possibly as a profession, nearly the actuarial profession needs to maybe like look at ways to adequately allow for this when we're doing valuations for schemes. But we're definitely starting off on a good track by looking at it from the investment perspective and the covenant perspective now as well.
Yeah, I mean, hopefully it is something that trustees of pension schemes are starting to wake up to, and you do see it increasingly mentioned in guidance around responsible investment that's starting to be published and is yet to be published. I'm conscious that the Society of Pension Professionals is putting a guide together around ESG for smaller pension schemes that might be invested in pooled funds and feel that they have sort of less control over the underlying assets in which the pension scheme is invested in. But it specifically makes the point that trustees need to think about financially material considerations, that could include ESG, and they also need to think about the impact of climate risk around the employer covenant. So you know, I do hope that particular issue starts to get broached in a bit more depth, in future trustee meetings, whether they still be virtually or maybe later this year, some in person. Kaz, I'm conscious of the time. What is the plan now? Is it for a 5 or 10 minute breakout session and then back to our plenary session?
Yes, what I'll do is it's just left 11:15, so I'll just start the breakout rooms and then I'll have everyone back just before kind of past, just to kind of finish up.
Lovely. Thank you very much.
No problem.
Right.
It just takes a couple of seconds, yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah, I can see the impact on participants, so it is working, Kaz.
Yes.
Right. I'm assuming that the breakout sessions have now been put in place. So hello again to everyone. That this is where hopefully engagement and discussion is a bit more encouraged. I don't know whether to take the English or the Scottish approach as done with face masks and say it's either expected or mandatory on you. I'm up in Scotland, so I'll lean towards the mandatory participation, please. And I'm just looking at those in the breakout session, and just to get the ball rolling, I'm going to pick on people, and I see that one of my colleagues, Claire, who I'm sure was listening intently around the presentation on climate risk and employer covenant. Claire, you and I have discussed this so many times now, but again, the focus has been on investment. Are you finding your research into this area starting to move in the employer covenant direction now?
Yeah, well, it's one of those things where when I'm doing the research and chatting to people, it's commented on, but all the actual like actions and things that I've seen are actually happening is definitely investment related. I thought Matthew's comment was really interesting. I've thought that before as well. Again, I've read some things about how actuaries should start considering climate change as a risk, for example, in mortality or like when setting the discount rate. But again, I haven't actually seen anything coming out or in practice in schemes that I've been involved in where action's actually taken on that.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's very much, but I mean, I suppose we're early days in investment as well. So hopefully in the next wee period, we'll start moving from just talking about it to actually doing something about it in the sponsor and actuarial funding kind of space as well.
Yeah, I was. Oh, sorry, go on.
Please.
Yeah, no, I was thinking off the back of Matthew's point there as well. I think with the mortality point was an interesting point, but maybe in the UK we think we're sort of disconnected from the risks associated with climate change. So, you know, the mortality impact might not be that big, but I think Richard did mention that, you know, there's more heat waves and things like that. So maybe there is a mortality impact. But yeah, I work on the investment side, so I'd see a lot of, you know, to do with the ESG stuff, because I think it's more of an international impact. And so the investments are more internationally focused, aren't they? So I think that's maybe why you've seen it earlier.
Yeah.
I think from my point of view, sorry, I'm thinking about it from a sponsor point of view. It's such a big topic, and knowing where to start is really difficult. So I could see that the tendency might be for somebody to perhaps acknowledge it as a risk and really just not know where to go next, because it's a really big piece of work that people have to commit to and have to try to unpick, and it's not within most people's wheelhouses to actually know where to start with it. It's you know, some of the examples that Richard gave there were really quite interesting around what's starting to happen out in sort of various different sectors, but that will start to grow and start to build, I think, and it's about keeping pace with the knowledge and the experience and skills as you go along. That's the tricky thing, I think.
Yeah, I agree. It's a really difficult one because it seems like a huge task, and obviously it is, but I think there's an aspect of just starting and just doing something that people are afraid to take because it just seems like don't know where to start, you know, we don't have the knowledge for this. And then I think that's also been made somewhat more difficult by people trying to help. So there's so many guidance, like different sets of guidance, so many different people trying to bring out different consultations to help. But I think that's, well, obviously trying to help, it's almost increasing that kind of like, this is a huge thing and I'm getting overwhelmed, and it just makes me feel less prepared and more confused about what to actually do for a lot of trustees.
Is that other people's experience as well? I mean, I'm sort of somebody who does research and technical full time. Just the volume of information in this area, and you know, and consider it in the realm not just environment and climate risk, but also social and governance aspects of ESG. And you know, from the perspective of somebody whose job it is to research this, sometimes I find it overwhelming. So you know, goodness knows what it must be like for trustees, in particular lay trustees, you know, who are acting as a trustee maybe just as a selfless act of good citizenship rather than as a profession. I mean, for this, I mean, just on climate change in general, not necessarily in the context of the impact on employer covenant, but people taking part in trustee meetings where this has gone on to the agenda. Is that the experience of how conversations go? Is just the subject just now is just, you know, so complex and so nebulous that it's a bit kind of, well, we'll stick it on the risk register and wait and see what happens.
Hi, John. Hi, Paul Ashcroft here of Wedlake Bowell, legal advisor. Yeah, I think that's absolutely right what you're saying. You know, there's a huge amount of volume, isn't there, of guidance out there, and I've seen it come up on a couple of trustee meetings. ESG's come up and it's been discussed, and I think in particular the one issue that we've looked at is trustees' duties, and the duties are act in the best financial interests. And we've seen how investing in new government or green bonds can be more costly compared to normal bonds, if you like. And I think with some schemes, perhaps a reluctance to do the switch. Have any of you had similar experience of that?
I mean, yeah, I've heard the similar arguments that even with the equity funds, the extra few basis points of fees, it's hard to almost like identify what extra you're getting for some trustees. But I was actually at the PLSA ESG conference a few weeks ago, and David Furs from TPR says that they are really clear that the fiduciary duty of trustees actually, it not only like allows trustees to take account of these risks and these non-financial matters, as people call them, but it also requires them to. So they were kind of pushing back on this like argument that the fiduciary duty is almost a reason not to do this.
Yeah, I think sometimes part of the issue is just getting trustees' heads around this. I happened to chair another webinar recently around opportunities for trustees to invest in timber. And part of the context of that was the impact on the planet and climate risk. But even then, you know, there was a lot of misunderstanding about sort of investment in timber, which is something that's not new. And historically, that might have thought about having actually a negative impact on the planet, and that risk still subsists as well. In terms of timberland in certain jurisdictions. So trustees worried about, you know, if they do it, you know, whether they're doing it in the right way as well. So clearly an aspect of that is getting the right advice. Kaz, I'm conscious of the fact that my screen has changed again, so I'm assuming we have gone back to the plenary session with everybody in the same room virtually.
No, the breakout rooms are still open. You've still got about 2 minutes to go.
I see. It must just have something to do with whoever's talking at a particular time. And so I mean, just, you know, so we cover both of the presentations today. I mean, on the annual the annual funding statement, which I have to say, you know, I didn't find, you know, it the most exciting read of 2021 so far. I mean, I don't know if this has come up at all at trustee meetings, but one related issue which I did see a very interesting article written on, actually it was by a firm of pension lawyers, was the extent to which trustees should now be taking the new funding regime into account in terms of as much as they know about it now before it kicks in, which might not be for valuations until the second half of 2022. But Paul, I don't know if that's something that maybe your firm has a view on. Are trustees taking prospective legislation into account, like things around long-term funding?
Long-term funding, I think yeah, it is something that we've started to see a bit more of. But in terms of prospective legislation, the main thing that we're starting to see sort of as a bit of a side issue is the new sort of powers under the Pension Schemes Act 2021. A lot of the powers don't come into force until subsequent regulations come into force, which are expected around October this year. But particularly when thinking about sort of criminal offences and trustees, and the new criminal offences for trustees, TPR has said that when considering intention for the new criminal offences, that they can look back at actions and things that have happened prior to the new regulations coming into force later this year. So I appreciate this slight aside from the new funding statement, but that is certainly the sort of area that we're seeing more trustees have to think about now when considering legislation having an impact in the future.
Yeah, indeed. So certainly the overall legislation is very much on the trustee radar now, but they're concentrating more on the here and now, or rather,
I think that's provisions
due to come into force in the next few months. Okay. Aware that we're now past 11:30, Kaz, I don't know if you want to take us back into the main virtual room, and I'll do a wrap up because I know people will have other commitments.
The rooms are just closing just now, so they should all start to come back through. There we go.
Okay, I think we're all back in the one virtual room, and as I just mentioned there, I'm conscious of the fact that we are now past 11:30 when we were due to finish, and I know people will have other meetings to go to, so I don't want to detain you longer than is necessary, but I would like to just say a special thank you to Emer Maguire and to Richard Walker for presentations that were not just interesting, but hugely topical and I think hugely timely. And I suspect discussions around these topics will continue long after the end of this webinar. So just with a further thanks for everyone with your participation. We'll call it a day at that, and I hope to see you at the next Future Influencers webinar, which I think, Kaz, will be in August.
The next one is in October.
No, oh my goodness. Okay.
Yeah, I think it's October. Yeah, it's every quarter. Yeah, so it'll be around about September, October.
Okay. Yeah. We don't want too much of a good thing. So we will see you in a few months, but I'm sure we'll be in touch before then with some ideas for subject. But if you have some ideas yourself or you would like to present, please get in touch with me or with Caroline Torres. You're very, very welcome to get more directly involved. Thank you, everyone. Stay safe and have a good day.
Thanks.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks very much.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.